This lecture is going to cover 10 pages in Chapter 10, pages 170 through 180, and Chapter 11. This deals with the market revolution and the politics of the market revolution, or the Age of Jackson. Here are our objectives for this lecture. 2 of the objectives come from Chapter 10, the other 3 are from Chapter 11. After this lecture, you will be able to list the 3 specific parts of the market revolution in early 19th century America and evaluate how the United States developed during this era. Secondly, you'll describe the growth of America's middle class during the first half of the 1800s and discuss some of the stronger movements toward reform during this era. Third, you will describe the changes that took place in American politics during the first decades of the 1800s and explain reasons for these changes. Fourth, you'll explain how Jackson's approach to the spoils system, the nullification crisis, the National Bank, Indian removal, and the Panic of 1837 reflected his vision of federal powers. And finally, you will explain the development of America's second two-party political system between the Democrats and the Whigs. You already know that Bleeding Kansas killed the second two-party system. Here's where it begins. But first, this is your discussion question for your outside reading about Jackson and Romney. Compare the elections of 1828 and 2012, specifically with regard to the tensions between economic classes and how the candidates use those tensions. What does this comparison tell us about the long-term structure of American society and politics? The economy was changing during the first half of the 19th century. We call these changes the market revolution. The market revolution refers to the time when an increasing number of farmers turn away from the idea of being self-sufficient and instead begin producing for the market. Prior to the market revolution, people only produce as much as they need. They produce as much as their family needs to consume, and maybe a tiny bit extra to trade with the neighbor down the street. After the market revolution, people are no longer producing things strictly for their own consumption. Instead, they're producing it as a business, right? They're growing enough food to sell on the market, not for their own use. This shift is what is the market revolution. The market revolution occurs in America for 3 main reasons, in this order. First, there is the transportation and communication revolution. Second, we begin to see a transition to commercialized farming. And third, we will see industrialization. And we'll talk about each one of these 3 reasons in turn. The first reason for the market revolution is that there will be a revolution in transportation and in communication during this time period. It's important to understand the importance of waterways during this time period. This is a time period in the 1820s to the 1840s before cars. So, if you wanted to transport your goods, you either had to do it in a cart being pulled by a horse, or the quickest and cheapest way of moving goods was through water. You wanted to put your goods on a boat, on a barge, and just sail them to the market. That's the quickest and cheapest way to do it, because imagine how much money it would cost to get enough food and supplies and protection and workers for you to walk 100 miles taking your goods to market. By the time you're able to sell your turnips in the marketplace, you've spent that much money just getting there. So waterways were very, very important. But waterways had a problem, because rivers typically only run north to south. They don't run east to west. They don't run south to north. It's only north to south. So if you live north and you want to sell your goods south, no problem. But if you're trying to go the opposite way, it too becomes expensive. So during this time period, the states and the federal government will begin to finance internal improvements. Remember, internal improvements are things today that we would call infrastructure. And so some of these internal improvements are things like turnpikes. Turnpikes are roads that were funded. So we have roads, better, but still not very good yet. But more importantly, they start to fund canals. Canals were really important because they linked two existing waterways. So now you could start on a ship going south, and now you can go east to west without getting off the boat, as long as you're linking two existing waterways. The most famous example of a canal building during this time period is the Erie Canal, which was an artificial river connecting Buffalo, New York, on the shores of Lake Erie, with Albany. And the reason that was important was because in Albany it linked up to the Hudson River, and you could sail straight down to New York City. So this canal was so important and so famous, there even became a folk song written about it. And you'll see mules on the path that are towing a barge with a rope, and they're moving tons of goods. So here's a little video with the folk song about the Erie Canal.
I've got me a mule, her name is Sal. 15 miles on the Erie Canal. She's a good old worker and a good old pal. 15 miles on the Erie Canal. We've hauled some barges in our day, filled with lumber, coal, and hay. And we know every inch of the way we go, from Albany to Buffalo. Low Bridge, everybody down. Low Bridge, for we're coming to a town. And you'll always know your neighbor, you'll always know your pal, if you've ever navigated on the Erie Canal.
So canals, very, very important. Erie Canal, probably one of the most famous ones. Other new technology that comes out during this time period are steamboats. Steamboats were developed in the early 1800s and have taken off by the 1830s. And they're especially important along the Mississippi River, because now instead of having to paddle your way manually up the river, you can simply let the steamboat paddle for you. And finally, railroads become important during this time period. Now, they're really in their infancy in the 1820s and 1830s. It's not until after the 1840s that they really take off. But railroads had distinct advantages over all these other technologies that we've talked about. For one, railroads did not depend on natural waterways. You can build a railroad anywhere. You don't have to build them where rivers already exist like you did a canal. Secondly, railroads did not freeze in the wintertime. You can use them all year round. Many of these canals freeze over, and there's months when you can't use them. They're just frozen. And finally, railroads were much faster, much faster than going on a turnpike, even faster in a lot of cases than going through canals. Even in this transportation revolution, we are going to see a sectional divide occur. You will see that the North will come to rely on railroads built by wealthy merchants and state governments. And these internal improvements are going to link together northern cities and western agriculture. And this is important to understand, because before in the North, your cities could only be as big as the surrounding countryside could provide food for you. It couldn't get any bigger because people would starve. But now, with the invention of railroads, the North can have all the produce that's being grown in the West. They can have everything being grown in Illinois, everything being grown in Kansas. It's just an overnight train ride away. So all of a sudden, these big northern cities, New York and Boston and Philadelphia, they can get much, much bigger because they're buying all this food from the West. So from this point forward, the West and the North are combined. They are together. The North can't survive without the West, and the West can't survive without the North. And so we are going to see more cities, and we are going to see bigger cities in the North, thanks to this transportation revolution. The South, however, is going to resist these changes. The South, again, will maintain plantation culture and dependence on natural waterways to move the cotton. The planters, most of them already live on natural waterways. They don't want to pay for this infrastructure. They don't want to pay for turnpikes. They don't want to pay for canals. They don't want to pay for railroads. Which means that the people are getting hurt in the South are going to be those human farmers. They're the ones that are going to have to pay these outrageous prices to get their goods to market. Planters are going to be just fine. And finally, we do have a communication revolution. Specifically, the telegraph gets invented. The telegraph uses Morse code, and this was revolutionary because for millennia, it took a very long time for news to travel, particularly for news to travel long distances. And now, for the first time in human history, news can be traveled in a matter of minutes. This had never happened before. And think of all the ways that email affects your life or texting affects your life. Take all that away, think of how different the world would be. That's what it was like for these people. The next reason for the market revolution was a transition to commercialized farming. The transportation revolution really changed how and what people farmed. Prior to the transportation revolution, most people lived in rural areas, and so they only produced enough for their own consumption, with maybe a little bit extra to barter with neighbors. They didn't need to produce more. It was too expensive to get their goods to market. So there was no reason to produce a lot of stuff. It was just going to go bad. In other words, people did not produce for a national or an international market. So people are only going to work as hard as they have to. But thanks to the transportation revolution, this changes, and we begin to see a major shift. Keep in mind, though, this culture that I'm talking about, only producing enough for your own needs, there is a big major exception to this, and that, of course, are the plantation owners in the South. They have always been producing tobacco and cotton for export. So, with the exception of them, this is how most people lived. Now, after the transportation revolution happens, this whole culture of just growing enough for your own use begins to change. Because now it's suddenly possible to get your goods to market. So all of a sudden, people will now start growing more than they need and growing surpluses to sell. You're also going to begin to see people specializing in one or two crops. Prior to this, because you were growing everything you need, you grew a little bit of everything. You grew a little bit of wheat and a little bit of corn and a little bit of tomatoes. Regardless of whether or not they grew best where you lived, you grew it because you needed it. Now, because people are no longer growing everything they're needing, they're going to start specializing. And so you're going to have belts forming across the country. You'll have the wheat belt. You'll have the tobacco belt. You'll have the cotton belt. And so you'll have the corn belt. So people will start specializing in certain regions and just growing one or two crops. In the South around this time, another gigantic change happens. Prior to the 19th century, they are not growing cotton in the South. Instead, they are growing mostly tobacco and rice. Now, the reason they're doing that is because there's actually two different types of cotton. There's something called short staple cotton and long staple cotton. Prior to 1793, and 1793 is a good year to remember because it's a marking point. prior to 1793, you know that they are growing tobacco and they're growing rice. But after 1793, the cotton gin gets invented. And so after 1793, this is when the South shifts and starts growing predominantly cotton. So prior to 1793, they are growing a little bit of cotton, and this is called long staple cotton. The problem with long staple cotton is that it's kind of picky. You can only grow it in certain areas, and its quality and yield isn't as good. The good cotton, the kind of cotton everyone would have loved to have grown, was called short staple cotton. But the problem with short staple cotton is that the fibers are really, really tiny, and it's filled with seeds. And these seeds were almost impossible to get out. It was so time-consuming, it was so difficult that you wouldn't make any money growing short staple cotton because you'd spend all of your money trying to get these seeds out of it and clean it. Enter the cotton gin. The cotton gin, you see a picture of its patent up there. You basically stuffed it in there and turned the handle and crank, 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 crank. All the seeds would fall out for you. So after the cotton gin gets invented, now it is possible to grow short staple cotton, which is easy, which loves the South and the South's weather, and which is very, very profitable. And cotton will become the leading economic sector in the South. Leading economic sector means that it is the most important element of the economy. It is the thing that is driving the economy. And so, we will see a cotton boom. Southern agriculture and economy is going to be completely taken over by cotton. And the American South will become the world's largest producer of cotton. And so because this is the leading economic sector, we will see spread effects, and we're going to see land consumption increase in the South. Remember, if you want to grow more cotton, you need to have more land. And we're also going to see slavery increasing in the South. As you know, when the Civil War happens, there were more slaves in America than at any other time in history. And that's all due to the cotton boom, because they needed these slaves to grow their cotton. So, the cotton boom is significant for a number of reasons. The first reason the cotton boom is significant is because we are going to see the South demanding westward migration. We're going to see the South demanding westward migration. The bad thing about cotton is that it's very hard on soil. Soil tends to wear out, and this is before we have our modern day fancy fertilizers. So you could grow cotton for a few years, and then you would kind of need to move on and find more profitable land. In addition, cotton is incredibly profitable, so more and more people want to grow it. But the only way you can grow cotton is by getting more land, so they're going to be going further and further west. But remember, this is before we've conquered the West. This is before manifest destiny has kicked in. And so the West is not empty. There are Native Americans living there. And so the more west we travel, the more trouble we're going to have with Native Americans. A second reason the cotton boom is significant is because it is going to lead to increased dependence on slaves. Cotton is a high labor crop. It requires a lot of TLC. And people can use slaves profitably to grow cotton even on bad land. And so, after 1808, the international slave trade is closed. And internal slaves are going to become even more valuable, and planters, because they need these slaves to grow their cotton, are going to cling to them ever more tightly. A third reason the cotton boom is significant is because it is going to impede any significant internal improvements in the South. The planters, as I said before, figured that waterways were good enough to transport their cotton. And most of them already have pretty good access to waterways. And so planters are going to block most of the internal improvements in the South. They're not going to want to pay for canals, not going to want to pay for turnpikes, they're not going to want to pay for railroads. So the people that get hurt by this, of course, are those small human farmers who can't afford land along waterways. And it's also going to stall the development of railroads. There aren't going to be very many railroads in the South, which, as you know, is going to turn around and bite them during the Civil War. They're not going to have the infrastructure to transport troops, to transport supplies. And finally, the cotton boom is significant because it hindered Southern diversification. Cotton was very profitable. So that is basically all the South does. There are a few places where they're growing sugar, there are a few places where they're growing rice and maybe tobacco, but by and large, the vast majority of South is growing cotton. Now, they're not producing. There is virtually zero manufacturing in the South. They do not manufacture there. Instead, they're relying on the rest of the nation or an international trade for all their goods. And the problem with this lack of diversification is that if cotton production or prices ever change, it's going to take the entire Southern economy down with them. And once again, this lack of diversification will bite them during the Civil War, because while the North has all these different types of crops, they can feed themselves, while they have manufacturing there, they can make what they need. The South, all they have is cotton. They can't eat it, and they certainly can't shoot it. So let's continue talking about commercialized farming in the West. The market revolution opens up the Midwest to farming. Before, if you wanted to live in Kansas, if you wanted to live in Nebraska, these weren't good places to live. You were too far away from the markets. Now, thanks to the railroads, thanks to canals, suddenly the entire Midwest of the United States is now open. You can move there and you can be profitable. So we begin to see commercialized agriculture, and regions begin to specialize in specific crops, such as wheat and corn, tobacco, cotton. This is all helped along by something called the Land Act of 1820. The Land Act of 1820 promoted settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains by setting affordable prices for plots of land. It promoted settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains by setting affordable prices for plots of land. And it leads to one of the largest internal migrations in U.S. history, as millions are going to pour into the West. And as always, remember, the West is not empty. Native Americans live there. So while these Americans are pouring into the West, keep in mind there's going to be conflict with Native Americans while they're doing it. And this migration is huge. From 1816 to 1848, we're going to have 12 new states join the nation. That's a lot of new territory, a lot of new states being added. Now, when Missouri tries to join the Union in 1821, it's going to bring the issue of slavery into the national spotlight. And we'll talk more about Missouri in a second. But all these people moving west is going to lead to social changes. With the transportation and market revolutions, as well as the addition of plenty of land, people do move west. And you can see the picture there. This is how we think of westward migration, the covered wagons heading west. Most of these pioneers moved west as family units. They're going out as families. And here's what happened. They had their old culture from where they lived in the East. But once they get out of established areas, they get into new areas, they meet new people, they experience new hardships, And thus, unsurprisingly, they begin to change. And we have a whole new culture called Western culture developed. And this is just how humans work. I promise you, if I took 10 of you and stuck you on a deserted island and came back in 10 years, your culture would be very different from the culture you came from. You would have developed your own unique culture. And so that's what begins to happen in the West. So Western culture stress specific things, and these elements of Western culture have continued into modern day American culture. These things have not gone away. And I'd be willing to believe that a lot of this stuff that I'm about to say, you believe in your head too. So the first element of Western culture that we see is this idea of white male egalitarianism. So egalitarianism, of course, meaning equality, right? We're equal. And this is the idea that you may be rich, you may be richer than me, I may be poor, but you're not better than me. I'm just as good as you, even if I'm poor and you're rich. Now, today, this is how we would take it, right, regardless of race, but they're not quite that evolved yet. And so note I'm being very specific here, white male egalitarianism. White men are equal, and they certainly wouldn't feel this way about a black man or a slave or even a woman. But for its time, this is very progressive, because prior to this era, there's a certain degree of deference, right, that people have to pay to each other. And so that's the second element of Western culture, is that there is a distinct lack of deference given to your social betters. Prior to this era in American history, you were expected, if you were poor, to defer to the rich in your society, to defer to the rich landowners, to defer to the educated, to the wealthy, basically do as they say. And in Western culture, there is a distinct lack of deference. They are not deferring to their social betters. Again, it goes back to that egalitarianism. Why should I listen to you? What makes you better than me? And finally, we see the ideal of rugged individualism emerging from Western culture. This is the idea that, yeah, it's hard. It's supposed to be hard. I can do it. I did it all myself. I pulled myself up by my bootstraps, and I didn't have any help, and I succeeded. This idea of doing it on your own, not needing any help. This also emerges from Western culture. And part of this was just kind of necessity. You were living on your little homestead in the middle of nowhere. The nearest farm is 30 miles away on horseback. You kind of had to figure out how to do it by yourself. And if you got through some kind of terrible hardship on your own, you would naturally feel very proud of that. So this kind of trickles in to the culture at large. Commercialized farming also has an effect in the North. Remember, one of the biggest changes that we see is that because the North is now linked to the West, we are going to see more cities in the North, and we're going to see bigger cities in the North. And again, this is because the railroads have come in, canals have come in, and they're linked to all that Western agriculture. So their cities can get very big because we can feed them now. Another change that commercialized farming is going to do to the North is that New England was never really a great place to farm. It was kind of cold and rocky. It's not great. But with the opening of Western agriculture, and with the means to get that agriculture to the North, we are going to see a decline in Northern agriculture. That's not to say it disappears. Even to this day, there are still plenty of farms in the North, but it becomes a lot less important, and it becomes a lot less numerous. So agriculture is going to decline in the North. Those that do continue to farm in the North will continue to be diversified. So they have economic diversification, whereas in the South you don't. And so they're growing a bunch of different stuff. Maybe one farm is growing apples, and the next farm over is growing wheat, and the next farm over is growing barley, right? They're all growing kind of different stuff. The third reason the market revolution happens when it does is because of industrialization. The transportation revolution and commercialized agriculture increased the demand for machines. And so, because there is an increased demand for machines, we will see the rise of industrialization and the beginning of factories. It is important to keep in mind when I talk about factories that this is the beginning of factories. So, these are not the full-scale industrialization factories like today, right? This is the very, very beginning of these processes. It has a long way to go before it becomes what it is today. Most industrialization takes place in the north. It will be almost non-existent in the south. They are not producing in the south. This is a northern thing. Prior to the 1800s, the way most manufacturing was done was through something called the putting out system. So here's how this would work. Say I wanted to make shirts. So I would take my cloth and I would take it to Farm A and I'd drop it off. And I'd say, okay, Farm A, cut these into shirts. I'll be back to pick them up. And then a week later, I'd go and get them. Then I'd take my unfinished shirts and I'd take them to Farm B. And I'd say, Farm B, I need you to sew buttons on these shirts. I'll be back to get them in a week. And then I'd go back and I'd get them. And I'd say, okay, thank you. And then I'd take them to Farm C. And I'd say, Farm C, okay, I need you to now dye these shirts purple and I'll be back in a week. So you would put out every stage of production to somebody else. And nobody was centralized in a single location. With the invention of factories in the 1820s, this changes. Factories brought all aspects of production under one roof. So now everybody who's making shirts are all in the same building making shirts together for every aspect of the production. For cutting the cloth, for sewing on the buttons, for dyeing the shirts, they're all together rather than having to go everywhere to do it. And this is not being done in all industries. The biggest place it gets started is the textile industry. And it's only later when we start to see it expand. As I told you before, this is a time period of rapid expansion. But unfortunately, slavery is going to throw a monkey wrench in all this. So here's the story. In 1819, Missouri wanted to enter the Union as a slave state. And so the question then becomes, what are we going to do? Is Missouri going to be a slave state? Is Missouri going to be a free state? This was a debate. Now this was important for two reasons. First, Missouri laid along the same latitude as several free states. So you see the 40 degrees there, right? A lot of those states that are running through that 40-degree mark, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, those are all free. So if Missouri comes into the Union as a slave state, it means that slavery is going to be crinching its way north. And it would be further north than it had been any other time since the American Revolution. So this is one problem. People are not happy about the idea of slavery spreading north. But a second problem is going to be that balance of power in the Senate. At the time, there were 11 slave states and 11 free states in the Senate. And so, if you admit Missouri as a slave state, it is going to upset that congressional balance of 11-11. Now it's important to remember, Northerners are largely not abolitionists, but they don't really want to see slavery spread out of the South. And it's not necessarily because they're so horrified by slavery, even though plenty of them don't like it. But they don't want it to spread first because a lot of them don't want black people around them. They're so racist that they would prefer to not see black people anywhere. But secondly, and more commonly and more importantly, they really think it's unfair to have to try to compete with slavery. Remember that idea of free labor. How can a man who's trying to work for wages possibly compete, possibly earn a good living if there are slaves around? So that concept of free labor is a big reason why the North doesn't want to see this happen. Southerners, for their part, believe that cotton demands the use of slavery. And by this point, they're starting to get very, very paranoid about the North messing with it. So for the South, they think that this is incredibly unfair, that people are giving them a hard time. The slaves are their property. You may not like slavery, but it's legal. Why are you making such a big deal about me bringing my property into Missouri? You're not yelling about me bringing in my horses. Why are you making such a big deal about my slaves? And it's here we start to see the South getting a little paranoid. Is the North going to do something to slavery? Are they going to try to get rid of slavery? Things will come to a head when a Democrat from New York named James Talmadge introduces something called the Talmadge Amendment. The Talmadge Amendment would have enforced gradual emancipation in Missouri. So slaves that were living in Missouri would have been phased out, and we would have eventually had freedom there. The Talmadge Amendment will pass the House. Remember, the North dominates the House because the North has such a bigger population. But because the Senate is equal, it's going to be killed in the Senate. And this Talmadge Amendment and the fact that they had to rely on the Senate to kill it seemed to prove to Southerners that the North really was hostile to slavery, and that it was so important that they keep that balance of power in the Senate. Because if they don't, look what's going to happen. The North is going to try to get rid of my slaves, is the way they see it. So, Congress is going to deadlock over Missouri. They're going to deadlock over whether or not to let it in, whether it's going to be free or slave. What are we going to do? This will finally be broken by something called the Missouri Compromise in 1820. The Missouri Compromise was brokered by a man named Henry Clay. And it basically had two provisions. First, it said that Missouri will enter the Union as a slave state, and Maine will enter Missouri as a free state. So Missouri will enter the Union as a slave state, and Maine will enter the Union as a free state. This lets that balance of power in the Senate stay equal, because Missouri will be slave and Maine will be free. The second thing it did was it drew a line at the latitude of 3630. You can see that red line there on the map. Territories north of that line would, with the exception of Missouri, would be free, and territories south of that line would be slave. Now note, the Missouri Compromise doesn't apply to the whole country, right? It only applies where that red line is. So basically the Louisiana Purchase is what we're talking about. So north of the line is going to be free, with the exception of Missouri, and south of the line will be slave. Let's talk about some of the changes that are occurring due to the market revolution socially. So, factories are going to lead to a growing gap between the rich and the poor. And for the first time in America, we're really going to see the development of a working poor develop. And this working class is going to be a group that worked in factories. The working class is working for wages, and this working class is becoming increasingly removed from the fruits of their labor. Characteristically, this group is going to be paid very low wages. They make very little money. They also have very little protections. There's no government oversight of working conditions yet. So, They're working in dangerous conditions. They can be killed on the job, and that's just too bad for them. There's nothing like sick time. There's nothing like overtime. There's nothing like a minimum wage. There's nothing like, worker safety laws. There's nothing like child labor laws. None of this stuff exists yet. So they're working for very low wages. They have very little protections. They tended to live in very poor housing. And most importantly, this group, this working class, has a very low chance for social mobility. It's very difficult for them to move up or to move down those social ranks. In the 1840s, our working class were usually Irish. It's the Irish that are coming over from Ireland. They're escaping the potato famine, where basically they're starving to death, and they're immigrating to America, and these are the people that are making up the bulk of our working class. And they're going to be terribly discriminated against. There will be signs put up in windows, "The Irish need not apply." There's even a story where they were trying to clear an area of swamp in Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. was actually built on a swamp, so they needed to dredge the swamp out. And of course, there was slavery in Washington, D.C. So they said, well, should we bring in the slaves? And the foreman said, no, slaves are expensive. They're worth something. Bring in the Irish. Let's let the Irish die doing it. So the Irish, in many ways, thought of as less than even slaves. So this is kind of who our working class was during this time period. Now, we also have another class emerging, and this is the middle class. So the idea prior to the 1820s was to become either a landowner or a master artisan. That is what you wanted to be, to make it, quote unquote. You wanted to either own your own land and be a small farmer or a big farmer, if you could get it, right? Or become a master artisan, become a master carpenter, become a master blacksmith. And the reason you wanted to do this was because people who worked for wages or did not own land were seen as dependent on others, and they were looked down upon. In the words of the American Revolution, they were seen as not virtuous citizens. Now here's the problem. By the 1820s, the majority of our population is now working for wages. And so, if the majority of your population is now working for wages, you can't say that they're all unvirtuous. You can get away with that when it's one or two guys in the village that has to work for wages. But when it's most people, you're going to have to change your definition of virtue. And so, those old notions from the Revolution that virtuous people were not dependent on others, that owned their own land, that didn't work for wages, that all starts to shift here thanks to the market revolution. Our old artisans, those master blacksmiths, those master carpenters, these are now going to become a management class. And this management class is what is going to become the middle class. So the artisans become managers, and the managers make up our middle class. And the middle class begins to develop a culture distinct from that of the elite property owners and distinct from that of the working class. They have their own culture, their own worldview. One of the most important ideas here is the idea of separate spheres. The idea of separate spheres said that there was basically two bubbles, right? Two spheres, and never shall those two bubbles meet. So there was the public sphere. The public sphere was characterized as masculine. The public sphere was the world of men, and this was the world outside the home. So men are expected to be doing the stuff outside the home. They're expected to be the main breadwinner. They're expected to bring in the money. They're expected to deal with business. They're expected to deal with politics. And this is where that idea comes from. Conversely, we will have the private sphere. The private sphere is characterized as feminine. this is the world of the home. And it's where women become the guardians of the home and become guardians of the family. And we'll begin to see a concept called the cult of domesticity forming. Under this cult of domesticity, they basically made it so that women were basically on a pedestal, that they were, by their very nature of being women, supposed to be more nurturing, more loving, and that it was their job to create a home and to take care of the children and make the home a refuge. So, this is kind of a mixed bag for women. On the one hand, this new respect for the morality of women gives them certain power that they did not have before. Prior to this era, the father basically was the head of the household too, and so he ran the inside of the house and he ran the outside of the house. Now, thanks to this cult of domesticity, the woman is going to have superiority in the area of home life. And so the father is not going to be necessarily interfering with the children. He's not going to be interfering with the home budget necessarily, with the shopping, with what she does. And that's a big change, because from going from no power to having some power, that is a big shift. We're also going to see a big decline in the birth rate. Women are going to be having less children, which is good for a lot of different reasons for women. And women overall will have slightly more autonomy. However, never forget that the husband is still legally the patriarch. For example, most married women cannot own property. So while the woman is getting a little bit more autonomy, legally she's still not much better off than a child. She still can't vote, she can't own her own property, she can't open a bank account in her own name, none of this stuff. So, it's getting better, but it's not quite good yet. These new public roles with women will also lead them to get involved into morality issues, issues like temperance, which is the no drinking of alcohol, and of course with abolition. Women are going to be very involved in the abolitionist movement. And it makes sense. Remember, we talked about the parallels between the mistress of a plantation and the slaves. In many ways, women's lives parallel those of that of slaves. Now again, be careful. They are certainly not equivalent by any stretch of the imagination. But there are some uncomfortable similarities, and women saw it. And so, lots of women are working to end abolition. So these new classes, the working class and the middle class emerging, are very significant. One reason this is so significant is because of the increase in people who had to rely on wages. Those old ideas of dependency, right, that you're dependent on somebody if you work for wages. Those old ideas of deference. I'm supposed to defer to my better and do whatever they say. And those old ideas of virtue, that the only virtuous people are people who own their own land and don't take wages. They have to change. America changes the way it thinks about itself thanks to this. And so, for the first time in American history, you are increasingly less likely to have your boss interfere in your personal life. That's something that you couldn't say before this time. Your boss, whoever you were working for, because you were dependent, quote unquote, on him, could interfere in your personal life. He could tell you when to go to church. You might need to get his permission to get married. He would tell you where to live. Now, that deference that you're showing to your boss by doing what he says is going to go away. And your boss suddenly just becomes your boss. You don't have to ask his permission to go on a date. You're also going to see people demanding respect. You may be my boss, but it doesn't mean you get to treat me bad. In addition, in general, for white males, this is a very good time in history, unless you happen to be Irish. But in general, for white males, their standard of living is going to steadily rise. So while their standard of living rises, we're going to see less voting restrictions on this group. so more and more of them are voting. And there's going to be less deference to authorities, which means that overall, white males are going to have more autonomy, and there's going to be more egalitarianism. And finally, for white males, we will see a greater chance for social mobility. Now that you know what the market revolution is, let's start talking about the politics of the market revolution. And historians typically characterize this as the age of Jackson, which we date from roughly the 1820s to the 1840s. By the 1820s, the politics of the revolutionary generation have changed. The revolutionary generation has basically died off. So Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, they're gone now. And so the politics of the country are going to change drastically from what it was during the Revolution. So politics before the 1820s was marked heavily by concerns about virtue, right? Who is virtuous? Virtuous meaning who is a good citizen? Who will do right by the country? So people were very concerned about virtue, and we can characterize this as having a high degree of deference, in which people were expected to defer to the wisdom of the more educated elite. And deference indeed extended to all areas of life, from the family and to work. But even here, as we just talked about, this too is changing. The 1800s increasingly come to be considered the era of the common man. And we sometimes refer to this shift away from the elite of the revolution and to the common man as a shift to the age of Jackson. And this shift happens primarily for 5 reasons. And we'll talk about each one of these reasons in turn. We see this shift happening because of the impact of economic booms and busts. We see cultural changes due to westward expansion. We see the expansion of the franchise, the expansion of voting. There's also going to be increased partisanship caused by the election of 1824. And finally, this is going to shift because of the rise of the second party system. And we're going, again, talk about each one of these shifts, each one of these reasons for this shift to the era of the common man on the next slides. The United States was becoming more market-driven as the market revolution kicked in. Now, thanks to a war going on in Europe called the Napoleonic Wars, demand for American goods are going to remain very, very high until something called the Panic of 1819 happens. When the Panic of 1819 happens, what happened was Europe's economy recovered from the Napoleonic Wars, and all of a sudden, demand drops for American goods and demand drops for American food. And so this partly triggers this panic. Remember, panic is the 19th century word for economic depression. The second thing that triggers the Panic of 1819 is that we have an institution called the Second Bank of the United States. And in an act of glorious bad timing, the Second Bank of the United States decided to tighten credit at the same time this demand dropped. So, when credit tightened, it became harder to borrow money, which means that the demand for land, and by the laws of supply and demand, also the price for land is also going to drop. So land prices are going to plummet, which means people are going to lose a lot of their money, a lot of their assets. And we're also going to see major bank failures across the country. In fact, almost every bank south and west of Pennsylvania in the country failed. And when a bank failed in this time period, when a bank went out of business, when a bank went bankrupt, your money was gone. It was as if it had never been. You could not get it back. So these two things together, the fact that demand drops precipitously following the end of the Napoleonic Wars, and the policies of the Second Bank of the United States, when they tighten credit, when land prices drop, when banks start failing, is going to trigger an economic depression that we call the Panic of 1819. Now, farmers in the West were actually hit the hardest by the Panic of 1819 because many of these farmers had bought their farms on credit. They had gone in and taken a loan. And now, thanks to the fact that they can't sell their crops, thanks to the fact that their land prices have fallen, they can't make their payments anymore. And their land is going to be foreclosed on. And so once this starts happening, because remember, this is basically everywhere south of Pennsylvania that there's some kind of economic catastrophe going on, the farmers start to look to the government for help. They start saying, okay, Mr. Government, are you going to protect me? Are you going to help me? And the answer in most cases was no. The government was not going to do anything to help you. And many Americans began to feel like that was wrong, that maybe the government should help protect them from some kind of economic disaster. Maybe the government should offer some degree of protection. And so this shift in the way they're thinking about the government, that maybe the government does have a role to help protect us from these economic problems, is going to be one reason why we see a shift towards the age of Jackson. A second reason for the rise of the age of Jackson is going to be cultural change due to westward expansion. With the transportation and market revolutions, as well as the addition of plenty of available land, people do start moving west. And here you see that glorious picture of Manifest Destiny again, right? She's laying cable, they're pushing the Indians off the picture, and they're heading west. And remember, once people got out of established areas, they're going to meet new people, they're going to experience new hardships, and so they're going to change. And thus a Western culture will develop. Western culture, among other things, stressed those ideas of white male egalitarianism. This idea that all white men are equal. Now again, we're being specific, right? Not all men are equal, not all people are equal, but at least all white men are equal. And once again, this is characterized by a remarkable lack of deference, especially considering what came before it. And finally, we do see that idea of rugged individualism being promoted. This idea that I worked hard and I achieved this by myself, I pulled myself up by my bootstraps and I made it. The thing about Western culture was it didn't just stay in the West. Western culture will eventually spread back to the cities. And so soon we will begin to see less deference in the cities. We will begin to see more demands for equality in the cities. And thanks to this Western culture spreading back, in many ways, the, quote, common man becomes celebrated and respected for the first time in American history. It became ideal to be the common man as opposed to being the rich. Another reason for the rise of the age of Jackson is going to be the expansion of the franchise. Remember, franchise means voting, being able to vote. And this is all tying together, as you can see, because once people are less deferential, once people begin demanding equality, we are going to see the political process have to catch up to that. And the political process will end up expanding the franchise. In the years immediately after the Revolution, most states limited voting to white property-owning males. So after the Revolution, if you were a white property-owning male, that's who was allowed to vote. And the reason was that they wanted to make sure that only, quote, virtuous people are voting. They want to make sure that only people with virtue, who are not dependent on others, who can look out for the common good, are voting. So they limit this. But during the first half of the 1800s, this will begin to change. Because again, of those changes that we're talking about, most people aren't necessarily property owners anymore. They're becoming wage earners. So they start to change these requirements in the early 1900s. And almost every state will remove property requirements for voting. So after they remove property requirements, your basic qualification for voting is that you are a white male. And so white males have increasing freedom and prosperity during this time period. Their standard of living is steadily rising. They have less voting restrictions. There is less deference expected of them. And they have a greater chance for social mobility. But while this expansion of the franchise and this expansion of prosperity sounds good, remember that there are still plenty of people left out of this. There are still plenty of people that are denied the franchise, that are denied prosperity. One big group, of course, are African Americans. And remember, when we're talking about African Americans, there's two different groups. We have slaves, which are obviously denied any type of benefits here. But we also have free African Americans living in the country. And even free African Americans are going to face severe restrictions on voting and severe restrictions on their freedom, severe restrictions on their social mobility. Another group that's excluded from this, of course, are women. Women are not allowed to vote. Women are not allowed to own property. Married women are not allowed to own property. So women are excluded. And of course, Native Americans are right out. We're basically trying to run them out of the country as fast as we can. So they too are not voting, and they too are denied access to this rising prosperity. The next reason for the rise of the age of Jackson was increased partisanship after the election of 1824. So here's what's going on. The initial two parties in the country were going to be the Democratic Republicans and the Federalist Party. Now, the Federalist Party, don't worry about them yet, but they disappear after the War of 1812. And so, when we get to the election of 1824, there is only one political party. And that one political party are the Democratic Republicans, because the Federalist Party has collapsed. So, in the presidential election of 1824, there are going to be 5 Democratic Republicans running for president. And because there are 5 people running for president, no one will be able to get a majority in the Electoral College. Now remember, the way our Constitution is set up, in order to win the presidency, you have to get a majority in the Electoral College, not a plurality. A majority means 50 plus 1, 50% plus 1. That is a majority. A plurality simply means you got the most votes. So maybe you got 40% and your opponent got 30%. If we're going by plurality, you would win. You got the most votes. But if we're going by majority, you would still lose because you would have had to get 51% to win. So nobody is able to get a majority of the Electoral College, though Andrew Jackson did get a plurality. So when there is no majority in a presidential election, it gets sent to the House of Representatives to decide. This is the way the Constitution is set up. In the election of 1824, the House of Representatives was only going to consider the top 3 candidates. And the top 3 candidates were Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, who is the son of former President John Adams, and a man named William Crawford. The other person that you need to know that's kind of instrumental here is Henry Clay. That's a picture of him, he of the Missouri Compromise. Henry Clay was the Speaker of the House, and he came in 4th. So he's not in the running. But Clay was incredibly important because he told his supporters, vote for John Quincy Adams. Don't vote for Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson isn't one of us. Vote for John Quincy Adams. Now Jackson is furious because Jackson actually won the popular vote. When you counted up all the votes, Jackson wins the popular vote. He also won the most electoral votes. He won the plurality, if not the majority. But thanks to Clay's support, the House of Representatives will choose John Quincy Adams to be president instead of Andrew Jackson. Shortly after becoming president, Adams is going to appoint Henry Clay as Secretary of State. The Secretary of State position at this time was basically viewed as the stepping stone for president. At first you're Secretary of State, and then the next time you're president is basically how this was viewed. To be fair, Henry Clay was an excellent choice for Secretary of State. If you had to make a short list, Henry Clay would have been on it. Nevertheless, Andrew Jackson declared that this was a corrupt bargain, that Henry Clay had been promised the Secretary of State position, and that's why he threw his support to John Quincy Adams. This was a corrupt bargain. There has been zero evidence for this claim that this was a corrupt bargain, but this is how Andrew Jackson interpreted it. And so Jackson is furious. He feels like he should have been president. He won the popular vote. He won a plurality of the Electoral College vote. But nevertheless, thanks to this corrupt bargain, John Quincy Adams is going to be president instead of him. And Jackson is going to promise revenge. So this leads us then to that final cause of the rise of the age of Jackson, and that is the rise of the second two-party system. You already know that the second two-party system was the Democrats versus the Whigs, and you know that bleeding Kansas kills the Whig Party and ends the second two-party system. Well, this is where the Whigs get born. So let's talk about the Whigs and let's talk about the Democrats. The election of 1824 indicated the need for a second political party because both Jackson and Adams were running as Democratic Republicans, and both of them were completely different politically. So it was very clear that we need to do something. We can't just all call ourselves Democratic Republicans. We need to separate ourselves. And so the followers of Andrew Jackson began calling themselves Jacksonians. And eventually, they would become the modern-day Democratic Party. So the Democratic Party had some unique characteristics. First, they were nationalistic and wanted to keep the federal government small. They were nationalistic and wanted to keep the federal government small. They truly did believe that they were the heirs of Jefferson, and Jefferson was all about small government and farmers. They also believed in a strong executive branch. They believed in a strong executive branch. Third, they believed that the government should not interfere with the way people behaved privately. The government should not interfere with the way people behaved privately. So, the government shouldn't be involved in things like temperance, right? Trying to get rid of alcohol. It's none of their business. The government shouldn't be involved in slavery. How you treated slaves, your property was your own business. Democrats also tended to separate America into two, and they divided America between what they called the people, and by people they meant specific people. The people were farmers, planters, and workers. So America was divided between the people, who are farmers, planters, and workers, versus the aristocracy. And the aristocracy were also specific people. The aristocracy were merchants, bankers, and financial agents. Merchants, bankers, and financial agents. This group supported westward expansion. They wanted westward expansion. And the Democrats really courted the common man. They really championed the common man. Opposing Jackson were the National Republicans, who later called themselves the Whigs. So Whigs, National Republicans, same thing. And during this time period, they come to be led by Henry Clay. Whigs wanted a stronger legislature than executive branch. They wanted a stronger legislature than an executive branch. And they also believed that the federal government should promote the moral health of the nation. They believed the federal government should promote the moral health of the nation. So the Whigs were in favor of things like temperance. Many Whigs were anti-slavery because they felt like slavery was wrong. Whigs were big supporters of market capitalism, and they denied class conflict. So this division that the Democrats are doing between the people and the aristocracy, the Whigs are going to deny that this is a problem. They believe in market capitalism. They think that all the classes are getting along. And they also supported something called the American system. The American system had three ideas to it. The first thing that the American system wanted was internal improvements. So Whigs want to see increased internal improvements. Remember, these are things like canals, turnpikes, railroads. A second thing the American system called for were economic institutions such as banks. They want to see lots of economic institutions such as banks around the country. Because remember, they're big believers in market capitalism. Banks help with capitalism. And finally, they wanted economic protectionism such as high tariffs. They wanted economic protectionism such as high tariffs. So they like a high tariff. If you have a high tariff, it means people buy American, buy your stuff. Many Whigs tended to oppose the expansion of slavery, though again, not usually slavery itself. They weren't too concerned about slaves, but they sure didn't want slavery spreading. And the Whigs tended to do best in cities and rural areas that embraced market competition. So they're going to be the strongest in the Northeast, right, where there's all those cities, where there's lots of competition, where there's lots of capitalism. Here's the thing about the Democrats and the Whigs. At this point, in the 1820s and the 1830s, neither party wants to talk about slavery. And the reason neither party wants to talk about slavery is because it is too divisive. It's tearing people apart. This leads to great political changes, this change in the two-party system. Because now these new parties will lead to politics becoming popular and becoming widespread for the first time. Politics will now become almost a form of entertainment. And so, We're going to see big political changes because of that. Now that politics is almost a game. Now that politics is popular. Now that it's widespread. So for the first time in history, political candidates, because of the expanded electorate, right, because of the expansion of the franchise, now political candidates actually have to mingle and campaign and talk to the common man. That certainly never existed before this time period. George Washington was not out there shaking hands and asking for votes. George Washington was George Washington, and because he was George Washington, you deferred to him and voted for him. That's all changing now. Now it's becoming a lot more like it is today. Politicians out there mingling, asking you for your vote. We're going to see lots of partisan newspapers spring up. The equivalent of Fox News and MSNBC today in newspaper form. There's going to be lots of campaign events. There's going to be barbecues. There's going to be rallies. There's going to be lots of alcohol at these things. And nobody was better at courting these political changes than Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson was a master at this. So who was Andrew Jackson? Let's talk a little bit about where he comes from. Andrew Jackson comes onto the scene in an era of growing egalitarianism. And we begin to see kind of this attack on the rich and attack on the privileged. And while people are starting to backlash against the rich and against the elite and instead embracing this era of egalitarianism, this era of we're all equal, Jackson himself came across as the common man. He was kind of what the common man thought the common man was. And he really was kind of selling himself as the embodiment of the democratic spirit. So Jackson was born on the frontier of the Carolinas to immigrant Irish parents. So he does really start at the bottom here. His parents are pretty poor. He's born in the Carolinas. They're Irish. Jackson is going to fight in the Revolutionary War when he is 13 years old, and he will be an orphan by the time he's 14. But he is a self-made man. He becomes a lawyer, and he eventually moves to Tennessee. Now, Tennessee at this time is still considered part of the frontier. It's still not completely Indian free. It's still not completely settled. While he's in Tennessee, he is eventually elected to the House of Representatives. He then becomes a senator, and he even becomes a Tennessee Supreme Court judge. Jackson owned a very large cotton plantation. He owned many slaves, so he is a slave owner and a planter. He was also a major land speculator in Tennessee. He sold off a lot of what is Tennessee today and got very, very rich doing it. And so while Jackson likes to come off as the common man, as you can tell from his biography, he was anything but common. He is very, very rich. He's very, very educated. He's had very, very powerful positions. So this isn't just Joe Schmo from down the street. But image is everything, right? And he comes off as common even though he is not. The other thing you need to know about Andrew Jackson was that he was very hot-headed. He has a temper. He's even fought several duels. So he's got a temper. And he didn't have disagreements. He had enemies. You were not allowed to disagree with Andrew Jackson and you guys will still be friends. You're either with him or against him. And if you're against him, you're his enemy. But he was, at heart, a nationalist. He believed in America as a union, and he believed in America first. He is perhaps most famous for his military exploits. During the War of 1812, Andrew Jackson took up the defense of the city of New Orleans. And he was incredibly popular with his troops. His troops called him Old Hickory because they said he was as tough as an old hickory stump. So he was really popular with his troops. And in the Battle of New Orleans in January of 1815, this is an overwhelming victory for America. We defeat the British in the Battle of New Orleans. It's not even close. And Jackson is hailed as a hero in the country. The downside to the Battle of New Orleans is that this war takes place after the peace treaty has been signed. Whoops, right? So this battle doesn't actually mean anything. But nevertheless, we won. And Jackson was the hero of this. So all of this is leading us up to the rematch between Jackson and Adams in the election of 1828. After the election of 1824, Jackson never really stopped running for president. And his supporters across the country are going to establish committees in support of him throughout the nation. And they're going to be helped along by a man named Martin Van Buren. Martin Van Buren is going to build up a very powerful political machine, and his supporters are going to be holding rallies, they're going to be, canvassing their neighbors, they're going to be writing letters the entire time between 1824 and 1828. Now, John Quincy Adams, bless his heart, he tried to be above politics like his father was. He's trying to act like the revolutionary generation did, right? Presidents like Adams, John Adams, presidents like George Washington, presidents like James Madison, they did not get down and dirty into the politics. They made no effort to reach out to voters. They were supposed to be above it all. And this is what this is what Adams is trying to do. He's trying to be above politics like his dad was. But unfortunately for Adams, the times have changed. You can't be above politics anymore. You need to be part of that common man. You need to be out there asking for votes. You need to be out there mingling. And Adams doesn't do this. Jackson, however, takes a very, very different approach. Jackson realized that there was this rising spirit of democratic ideals and white male egalitarianism. He recognizes this, that people are demanding more and more equality, that people are expected to be treated fairly and that not be expected to give deference. And so Jackson is really going to begin courting the masses. He's going to be intentionally courting that common man, reaching out to him. So Jackson's going to do things like organize rallies, and of course let the beer taps flow when people showed up. He's going to be sponsoring barbecues to get voters to come and vote for him. And Jackson is going to be using his frontier roots and his military successes to be both a military hero and to promote himself as the common man. Right? He's saying, I was born on the frontier just like you. I know what it is to struggle just like you. I'm a military hero. I bet you fought in the army. I'm just like you. I'm a common man. Now, again, we know this is highly problematic. He's a very rich planter. He's not exactly common, but this is a very effective argument. People are like, yeah, I was on the frontier too. Yeah, I was in the army too. So they're relating with Jackson. They're viewing him as this common man. The election of 1824 was also characterized by a lot of mudslinging. Mudslinging is when you attack your opponent's character. And this was a vicious mudslinging affair. And both sides did it. Jackson's camp said Adams was a corrupt aristocrat, and he was a libertine. In case you're wondering what libertine means, it's basically a fancy word for calling Adams gay, basically saying Adams was gay and sleeping with the Tsar in Russia, which is completely untrue, but in the 19th century you can see why this might be a problem to be called gay. And Jackson, on the other hand, was called a gambler. To be fair, this is probably true. He probably did gamble. Jackson was called a murderer. This also is probably true if you count duels, right? And he's even called an adulterer. And that's the important one, because this adulteral charge is also accidentally true. And this story that I'm about to tell about Jackson and his wife Rachel really helps to explain Jackson's mindset when he's president, why he behaves the way he does to his political enemies while he's president. So here's the story. In 1791, Andrew Jackson married a woman named Rachel Robards. Now, Rachel had been married before, but her husband was not a good man. There's accounts of, there's some domestic violence stuff going on. He was just not good. And so she is actually the first person to ever get divorced in Tennessee. And so in 1791, Jackson and her get married, thinking that her divorce had gone through, thinking that the divorce had been final. When actually, due to a technicality, it hadn't gone through yet. She was still technically married. So, this is just a snafu, but technically, they're committing bigamy, right? Technically, Rachel's married to two people. Now, eventually, they get this worked out. It gets fixed. They get remarried. It's not that big a deal. But once the press hears the story, and remember, these are partisan newspapers, so it's like watching Fox News or it's like watching MSNBC. The press, John Quincy Adams supporters, are going to lambast her. They're going to call her terrible names, that she's a whore, that she's an adulterer, that she's going to hell for committing bigamy. And Rachel was a non-combatant. Rachel was incredibly shy. She didn't even want to go to Washington, D.C. if Jackson won, because she was afraid of having to deal with all these people. She was very, very sensitive, very, very upset about people questioning her character. And she ends up dying in December of 1828 of a heart attack right before Jackson is inaugurated. And Jackson blamed the press, blamed his opposition for her death. He thinks that she would have never had this heart attack had she not been under such stress from people calling her these horrible names. And he's never going to forgive the other side. He's never going to forgive John Quincy Adams or John Quincy Adams supporters or his political enemies. He never forgives them because he blames them for Rachel's death. And he never gets over her. He mourns her for the rest of his life. He has them hang her portrait at the foot of his bed because he said that the first thing he needs to see every morning and the last thing he needs to see every night is Rachel. She liked gardens, so he buried her in a garden, and he went to visit her grave every day. So he never gets over Rachel, and he always hates and blames the people he thinks took her from him by lambasting her character this way. In the election of 1828, Jackson does eventually win. Jackson is the most successful with three groups. The first group that really likes Andrew Jackson are Southerners. Southerners really like Andrew Jackson because of his Indian campaigns. You'll see in just a few slides that Andrew Jackson and Native Americans, somewhat of a problematic relationship. And the South supports that because remember, the South wants to expand west, the South wants more land, Native Americans are in the way. So the South really likes Jackson. Westerners are also very impressed with Andrew Jackson because, remember, the way Jackson's selling himself is, I'm a frontiersman. I'm just like you. So, the West, big supporters of Jackson. And finally, the working classes in the North really like Jackson. The working classes in the North, those Irish, for example, who resented the elitism of the Federalists, they're also going to support Jackson. So, with Jackson's win, you can very clearly see a sectional divide, right? Even before the Civil War, the country does divide along northern and southern lines. Because Jackson, as you can see on the map there, is going to win the South and the West very, very easily. But Adams is going to carry the Northeast. So already, as early as 1828, the country is already dividing itself between North and South. More importantly, Jackson's victory symbolized a major shift in American politics. Now, politicians will begin to pander to the masses. It's going to be style over substance, right? Who's the most popular, not necessarily who's the smartest. Who looks the best as opposed to who is the best. So they're pandering to the masses. The style over substance starts to happen. We also begin to see new techniques of mass mobilization begin. And these new techniques of mass mobilization included things like campaign literature. They're handing out push cards, they're handing out posters, they're handing out flyers. We're going to see candidates making public speeches. They would call it stump speeches, right? Because they'd stand on a cut down tree stump and they'd talk to whoever was passing by. There's going to be advertising. People advertising their candidates, wearing campaign buttons, ads in newspapers, just like today. This didn't exist before the election of 1828, and now all of a sudden it does, and it's been with us ever since. And so, Jackson's victory is oftentimes celebrated as the victory of the common man over the aristocracy. But as you know, this is kind of problematic describing it this way, right? Because it's not like Jackson was some poor, dumb frontiersman. Jackson was a very rich slave owner who had been a senator and a Supreme Court justice and a land speculator. So characterizing this as a complete victory for the common man is somewhat problematic. But it is true that his supporters were overwhelmingly those common men, right? It's the common man in the South that's voting for Jackson. It's the common man in the West that's voting for Jackson. It's the common man in the North that's voting for Jackson. And if we hadn't had that expanded electorate, if we hadn't had those notions of deference changing, somebody like Jackson would have never been elected. So when we think about it like that, perhaps it is a victory for the common man, because the common man got to vote, whereas before he never would have. So, in Jackson's presidency, in many ways, his presidency helps to shape the future of the United States. And it is rocked by scandals and it is rocked by issues. The most important are 4 major issues. And these are patronage, the nullification crisis, the bank war, and Indian removal. And we will talk about each one of these issues, patronage, nullification, the bank war, and Indian removal, on the next slides. So the first issue in Andrew Jackson's presidency is going to be patronage. Patronage is the direct exchange of government jobs in return for political campaign work or support. And this is usually called the spoils system, is another way to say it. Now, in some ways, there's not too much surprising here, right? You help me get elected, I feel like I owe you, so I give you an appointment somewhere. But this is being taken to an extreme. They are specifically appointing people to places in order to get their support. It's kind of a quid pro quo thing going on here. So, upon the advice of the political mastermind, Martin Van Buren, Jackson will actually fire a lot of federal workers and replace them with committed Democrats. So this isn't just, I have an open spot, you help me out, let me put you in. This is, I'm going to fire somebody from their job so that my friends can have a nice cushy job. And he especially does this in the North. And the reason he does it in the North is because he's weak there. So if he can, remember, the only reason why you have this nice cushy job is because Andrew Jackson's president, well, you're going to work really hard to make sure Andrew Jackson stays president. So this is why he's concentrating on the North. More importantly, patronage begins to shift the focus and the power of the federal government away from Congress and toward the president. And that's a major thing, this shift in power. Because prior to this era, Congress was the most important branch of government. But now, thanks to patronage, that power is slowly starting to shift in favor of the president. The second big issue that's going to happen in Andrew Jackson's presidency is called the nullification crisis. So let's give some context here to what's going on. At heart, this is a debate over supremacy, okay? Who has the most sovereignty? Do states have the most sovereignty, or does the federal government have the most sovereignty? That's really what's at stake here. Who gets to call the shots? Is it the states that call the shots or the federal government? Who's supreme? And this really is something that's still, even to this day, being debated. So here's the context. When Jackson was elected in 1828, Americans were still very anxious about the state of the economy. Remember, we had the Panic of 1819, wasn't that long ago. America's still trying to recover. And thanks to the market revolution, the economy is changing very quickly. And so this is making people feel a lot of economic anxiety. The economy is changing. We're not sure what it's changing to. A lot of Americans can't keep up with it. So there's a lot of economic anxiety being caused by this market revolution. This is especially true in South Carolina. In South Carolina, the cotton market had been struggling during this time period. And so South Carolina is having a hard time. And it's never easy to look at yourself and go, well, maybe I shouldn't be growing so much cotton. Instead, South Carolina would like somebody else to blame. They need somebody or something to blame for their hard times. So South Carolina is going to focus their ire on high tariffs. They're going to blame high tariffs for all their problems. So remember, a tariff is a tax on imported goods. And the whole reason why you enact a tariff is so that you make your home goods artificially cheaper, right? Say we have bottles of water. I make bottles of water in America and Mexico makes bottles of water. And assume that they are the same quality. So I haven't been producing these bottles of water very long. I can sell them for $1. Mexico, on the other hand, has been making these bottles of water for 50 years. They've got this process down. They've got it all worked out. So they can sell their bottles of water for 50 cents. So naturally, if you had to choose which one are you going to buy and assume they're equal in quality, you would, of course, buy the Mexican one rather than the American one because it's so much cheaper. But if I slap a tariff on water bottle imports, and if I say, okay, every bottle of water that comes in has to pay $1 tax, that dollar tax gets passed on to the consumer. So now that Mexican water, instead of costing 50 cents, costs $1.50, while mine still stays $1. My good is now artificially cheaper. So when the consumer is now offered this choice, would you like the $1.50 Mexican bottle of water, or would you like the $1 American water? They, of course, choose American water. But there is a problem with tariffs, and this is just how tariffs work. It's just one of those laws of nature. The sun will come up in the morning, and the stars will shine at night. And if you enact a tariff on one country, they, in turn, will put the same tariff on you. They will retaliate. So if you put $1 tariff on bottles of water from Mexico, I promise you Mexico will turn around and put $1 tariff on waters from America. It's just how it works. So this is what ends up happening. Beginning in 1816, Congress enacted a high tariff in order to protect American industries, such as the textile industry. The textile industry is the industry that they are the most worried about. They want to protect it from cheap British imports. So, obviously, the North benefits from this. Remember, it's in the North where all the textile factories are. So the North loves this tariff. The West also loves this tariff because this tariff makes Western crops, such as hemp, such as wheat, all these crops are cheaper now than European imports, so Americans are buying from the West too. The tariff, however, hurts the South. Remember, Europeans do not grow competing crops with the South. You can't grow cotton in Europe. You can't grow tobacco in Europe. And so the tariff doesn't help the South. It's not like they're getting in a bunch of cotton imports that they have to compete with. In fact, the reverse is true. Because Europe is going to slap on retaliatory tariffs, it means it's going to be harder for the South to export their goods. And remember, the place that the South sells most of its cotton is going to be Europe. And so thanks to this tariff, it's going to be harder for them to sell their goods. Remember, too, that the South does not manufacture. And so they are still importing a lot of their finished goods from Europe. They're importing in furniture. They're importing in tapestries. They're importing in fabrics. And now, thanks to that tariff, they have to pay higher prices for those things as well. So, tariffs very quickly become a sectional issue. And you can see here in this cartoon, this is a primary source from the time period. If you look at the weather vane at the top, north is on the side of the fat guy, right? South is on the side of the skinny guy. And you can see what's being piled on the shoulders of the skinny guy are tariffs, 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 taxes, 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 right? The South is being punished, and he's skinny, and he's gaunt, and he's starving. And you look at the North thanks to these tariffs, right? The North is booming, and he's fat, and he's rich, and he's happy. So this is kind of how they are viewing the tariff. So, things are going to come to a head with a new tariff that gets passed in 1828. And the tariff of 1828 is sometimes called the Tariff of Abominations. In 1824, Congress had enacted a high tariff, which the South already objected to. Then, in the presidential election of 1828, because Jackson wanted to get support from the North, Jackson proposed this ridiculously high tariff. Right? Jackson says, let's have this, the tariff rate that eventually gets passed in 1828. Let's have this, because he knows the North likes tariffs, and he thinks that this tariff is so ridiculously high that nobody would ever pass it, right? It's not going to get passed. Jackson looks good for suggesting it, though. It's a win-win. To his shock and horrible dismay, however, this tariff does actually pass right before Adams leaves. And Adams, with a smile and a probably ha-ha, signs it into law. And so this is called the Tariff of Abominations by the South, because it raised the tariff to really high levels. The South, particularly South Carolina, is going to be furious over this tariff. And eventually, South Carolina is going to hold a conference. And from this conference, there's going to emerge a document called the South Carolina Exposition, which was written by John C. Calhoun. John C. Calhoun happens to be the vice president under Andrew Jackson. So these two are actually going to have a major falling out. Andrew Jackson's never going to forgive him once he figures out that Jackson wrote the South Carolina Exposition. In any event, Calhoun, in writing this, is grappling with the serious problem of political theory. And this political theory problem is, how do you protect the rights of a minority in a government based on rule of the majority? How can you do that? How can you protect minority rights if we are in a system where majority rules? How do you do that? That's the big question he's trying to ponder here. How do I protect the minority, in this case the South, who doesn't like the tariff, when we have a government based on majority? The majority being the North and the West, who like the tariffs. So, this pondering of this question gives rise to the political idea of nullification. Nullification has a few different steps to get to where it goes. So, the idea behind nullification is that the United States was made up of independent and sovereign states. That's the first premise here, that the United States was made up of independent and sovereign states. So when states joined the Union, they did not agree to give up their autonomy. They might have joined in, but they never said, we give up our freedom, we give up our sovereignty. And if that's true, if when states joined they didn't give up their autonomy, then it must mean that every state had the right to reject any federal law it deemed unconstitutional. If you're following this logic, if a state never gave up their autonomy, then every state should still have the right to reject any federal law it deemed unconstitutional. Now, hinted here, deeper down, is this idea that if the state objected to what the federal government was doing, they could even in theory secede from the Union. But we're not going to go there for about 30 more years. So this is the idea behind nullification, that states were independent sovereign states. When they joined the federal government, they did not give up their autonomy, and that they could reject any federal law that they deemed unconstitutional and even maybe secede. So in 1832, when Congress did not revise the Tariff of Abominations, South Carolina's legislature is going to pass an ordinance nullifying, or in other words, canceling, the tariffs of 1828 and the tariffs of 1832 in South Carolina. And they're going to be basing this on these arguments that were laid out in the South Carolina Exposition and this whole idea about nullification, that they have a right to do this. They have a right to say, we're not following this federal law. Jackson was a nationalist at heart. He believes in the United States as a union. He believes it's whole, that it's indivisible. And he viewed South Carolina's actions as a direct challenge to the federal government. He did believe the federal government was supreme, that South Carolina can't challenge it. And so, in response to South Carolina's nullification acts, Jackson will issue a proclamation on nullification in December of 1832. In the proclamation of nullification, Jackson stated first that states of the Union were not independent. States of the Union were not independent. Therefore, no state had the right to reject federal law. No state had the right to reject federal law. The only people that are allowed to reject federal law are the Supreme Court through the power of judicial review. That's the only entity that can reject federal law, the Supreme Court, because they have the power of judicial review. And finally, he firmly asserted that the Union is perpetual. The Union is forever. And it is treason for any state to try to withdraw from the Union. You cannot secede. You cannot leave. That would be treason. So to show how serious he is about this, he also passed something called the Force Bill in March of 1833. The Force Bill gave the President the authority to use the Army and Navy to put down insurrection. This gave the President the authority to use the Army and Navy to put down insurrection. And, by the way, in theory, this could also mean enforcing the tariff if some recalcitrant state isn't going to listen. But remember, at heart, Jackson is a nationalist. At heart, Jackson doesn't really want to fight. And so, he does offer South Carolina a face-saving way out. He offers them a way to back down and still not look bad. And so, at Jackson's urging, Congress will pass a compromise tariff. This compromise tariff lowered the tariff. And this tariff, new tariff, went into effect the same day as the Force Bill. So in response to this compromise tariff, South Carolina does back down, and South Carolina will repeal its nullification of the tariffs. But just to prove their point, because they're South Carolina, at the same time they go ahead and nullify the force bill, just to prove their point. Jackson ignores the fact that they nullified the force bill and just said, thank you for finally nullifying this Nullification Act, very good, and things are going to calm down. So just to recap what happens in the nullification crisis, there's this cute little cartoon I found on YouTube, and we'll play that one for you.
In the last episode of History Sci-Fi Theater, the North had come to love tariffs because they made people buy more American manufactured goods, while the South hated tariffs because they hurt trade with Europe. And now, this week's episode. In the dark recesses of his underground laboratory, Dr. Regional Division transmogrifies North-South tensions into the tariff of abominations.
It's alive!
Southerners fear the tariff.
Look for your life!
It'll ruin our economy.
While Northerners don't mind it at all.
It's kind of cute, really.
What a sweet.
Andrew Jackson's Vice President, John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, says the South has the right to secede or withdraw from the Union.
Either that thing goes or we go.
But President Jackson isn't having it.
You'll stay in the Union, whether you like it or not.
Will not.
Will too.
Then lock up that monster.
By 1832, there were newer, even bigger tariffs, and the country was on the brink of civil war. When Jackson and Calhoun brought in respected statesman Henry Clay, who had previously developed the Missouri Compromise of 1820, to tame the beast.
I'll save the day. Unity is more important than tariffs.
And so a compromise was reached. Northerners accepted lower tariffs, and Southerners remained in the Union. Henry Clay had once again defeated the evil Dr. Regional Division. Or had he?
So, as you can see, this whole idea of should the North and the South even be together, this whole idea of secession, it's floated very early on. Like I said, the Civil War is a very long time in coming. So why is the nullification crisis significant? Why do we care about this? Why do I make you learn it? Well, there's a couple of things going on here. This incident was very serious, and it could have led to secession and civil war. And so the issues that are brought up by the nullification crisis, the issues of state versus federal power, the issues of secession, the issues of nullification, are not resolved by this incident. These issues are still floating around. And these big issues, who's supreme, state or federal government? Can we secede? Can we nullify federal laws? These are all major issues that are going to be factors in the Civil War. All these things do eventually come together. Furthermore, these issues have not gone away, despite what the Supreme Court says. We still see this debate in America today, mostly over things like federal gun control, over things like Obamacare, over things like abortion. It's still very much in debate. Who has supremacy here, the states or the federal government? So I'm going to play a little clip for you so you can see what I mean about this being important today as well.
Of course, in the end, it may not even matter what Congress does with this or any law. Jason Jones explains.
Politicians at the state level are increasingly frustrated with what they say is an overreach by the Obama administration.
We know what is best for us here in Kentucky, and we don't want to be dictated to by Washington, D.C.
For Kentucky State Senator Damon Thayer, the feds have gone too far.
The left-wing liberals in Washington, D.C. think that they know what's best. They hate guns. They hate law-abiding citizens who want to buy guns, and we fear that there will be federal gun laws that actually take away what we believe is our Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms.
Other than that premise being completely false, what kind of message would you send to those gun grabbers in D.C.?
The Senate passed a bill that would have nullified any new federal gun law passed after January 1.
He's talking about nullification, an age-old legislative tactic where states pass specific laws exempting themselves from federal laws. It's a flawless political technique that dozens of states are embracing.
despite the fact that the Supreme Court made nullification laws illegal on several occasions. But that is not the point.
Barack Obama lost Kentucky in a landslide in 2008 and 2012. So if we disagree with those policies that we've stated twice, why should our governor have the right to go ahead and, by unilateral fiat, implement the most unpopular law that this president has passed?
If you didn't vote for the president, why should his administration's laws apply in your state?
Correct.
Other than the fact that it's the law.
Other than the fact that it is the law.
But apparently some, like county-level Kentucky Judge Tommy Turner, don't think Thayer has the right to nullify any federal law.
Nullification law, in my opinion, is not legal. It's impossible for the state to ignore federal law. I mean, basically, they'd be ignoring the United States Constitution.
So what are you going to do about it?
We introduced a bill to nullify state laws.
So, okay, I'm just confused. You're nullifying the state's nullification law.
In simple terms, yes, that's correct.
But that's not legal.
Yes. We feel that nullification is something that can't be done. But if it can be done, we're going to do it.
All of this legal speak is very confusing. Explain it to me with some Kentucky folksiness.
Well, to use a statement that I have heard since I was little, what's good for the goose is good for the gander.
And what the hell's a gander?
The meaning is that if one can do it, the other can do it.
Right. Like I said, what's a gander?
I can guess, and I may be correct, but I may not either, so.
Just saying, you've been saying it since you've been a kid.
Yeah.
Look it up. But Thayer isn't concerned with Judge Turner's nullification proposal.
I think it probably lacks legal standing.
And what about your nullification that also lacks legal standing?
That's part of the debate. I'm not sure that Judge Turner's nullification of nullification isn't more than a publicity stunt on his behalf.
So what's good for the goose is not good for the
gander.
Right, and the gander is?
A male goose.
Exactly. Is this so hard? But if the feds can get nullified by the states, which they can't, and the states can get nullified by the county, which they can't, where does it end?
It is a vicious circle, and maybe one that will turn around and bite us. I think if our citizens rose up and decided that they wanted to individually nullify laws that had been handed to them, then yes, we would have chaos, we'd have anarchy.
No, I don't see that happening.
Judge Turner thinks it will happen.
We in Kentucky are a law-abiding society.
He's right. Kentucky is a law-abiding society, except for the laws they don't feel they need to abide by. So, are there any laws that affect your life that you would like to see nullified?
Well, I don't think it's a right to pull someone over because they don't wear a seatbelt. Motorcycles don't have to wear a seatbelt.
I personally think I can handle my drinks, and I think the DUI laws in this state, for instance, are a little bit low.
Smoking, I don't smoke, but I think you should be able to smoke wherever you want.
You can handle more.
You know, one time I blew a .22, and I was still pretty darn lucid.
Yes, who's the county or the state or those left-wing liberals in D.C. to tell us what to do? Americans know best at the local level.
You like the fresh air, right? There we go.
And laws shouldn't apply to us if we didn't vote for the people who made them. I mean, seriously, is it really going to kill someone?
Oh.
No good. We know what's best for ourselves and our children.
Thank you, Jason. We'll be right back.
So as you can still see, this issue of nullification has not gone away. We're still fighting over it 200 years later. The next issue in Andrew Jackson's presidency was something called the Bank War. So in order to understand the Bank War and what's going on, you need to understand America's monetary system prior to 1863. Until 1863, there was no standardized national currency. Instead, there were several different forms of money. One form of money was specie. Specie is actual metal, right? So you're paying in actual gold or paying in actual silver. There was barter. You trade me some eggs for some of my milk. And there were state banknotes. And these state banknotes were the paper money. The problem with paper money was that its value fluctuated depending on how much of it there was and on the solvency of the bank. So you never knew from one day to the next how much your paper money was worth. And remember, if a bank ever goes out of business, your money is worthless. Your money is gone. So paper money being issued by individual banks is pretty problematic. We also have an institution during this time period called the Second Bank of the United States. The Second Bank of the United States was created by Congress in 1816 and was given a 20-year charter. Now, at first, this bank gave out very easy loans to people who wanted to expand. Whoever wanted a loan basically got one. But then we had that panic of 1819 when the bank began calling in a lot of loans. And what ends up happening in the panic of 1819 is that a lot of Americans couldn't pay their loans, they get foreclosed on, they end up losing their farms, they end up going to debtor's prison. So the bank and the bank's policies end up hurting a lot of people. And while the bank did not directly cause the panic of 1819, a lot of Americans blamed the bank for this. The president of the Second Bank of the United States was a man named Nicholas Biddle, and Nicholas Biddle becomes the president of the bank in 1823. Biddle really wanted to use the bank to stabilize the economy. And the main way that Biddle is going to do this is by limiting the amount of paper money in circulation. So Biddle is going to be pulling in all that paper money. It's going to be causing the economy to contract. So that's our background. Enter Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson hated the bank. In the 1790s, when his bank collapsed, Andrew Jackson actually lost all of his money. And so ever since the 1790s, Andrew Jackson has personally hated the bank. And remember, Jackson doesn't have disagreements. Jackson has enemies. And so he viewed paper money as very dangerous, and the only money that Jackson trusted was specie. So, in 1832, 4 years before the bank's charter is set to expire. Remember, the bank is chartered for 20 years. So 4 years before the bank's charter is set to expire, Nicholas Biddle applied for a renewal of the bank charter. Now, Jackson thinks that Biddle is doing this to make the bank an issue in the election of 1832. And he thinks that Biddle's purposely doing this to hurt Jackson's campaign. Jackson is running for re-election in 1832. And so he thinks Biddle's doing this just to spite him. And so Jackson vows to destroy the Second Bank of the United States. How dare you try to mess with my re-election, Nicholas Biddle? I will destroy the bank. Congress ends up rechartering the bank in 1832. Congress says, yes, let's keep the bank. But Jackson is actually going to veto the charter. And in Jackson's veto message, he's going to say that the bank was a, quote, nest of special privileges for the wealthy who were out to hurt America's humble poor. So, vetoing the bank, it was popular with some people and it was very unpopular with others. The working classes, Westerners, and Southerners, the people that liked Andrew Jackson, were very happy about the bank being vetoed. But of course, this was also very unpopular with Northerners and merchants. So after Jackson was re-elected, he decided he didn't want to wait 4 years for the bank to go out of business, but instead he sets out to crush it by removing all the federal deposits from this bank. And once all the federal deposits were removed, it effectively put the Second Bank of the United States out of business. So after the Second Bank of the United States goes out of business, we need to put all that federal money somewhere. And so Jackson begins to put federal deposits into several state banks. And of course, these state banks, also called pet banks, just like teacher's pet, these state banks were usually owned by his friends. And so once again, we can see patronage coming into work here. Now, there's some pretty serious consequences to this. Without a central bank to control things, like the Second Bank of the United States did, this means that we will see an explosion of state and local banks. And these state and local banks are going to be operating with very limited regulation, and usually without enough currency. So this is kind of crazy banks doing whatever they want. And we called this wildcat banking because there were basically no rules. Banks are doing whatever they want, responsible or not. We will also see hundreds of paper currencies appear, which is ironic because Jackson hated paper currencies. But the result of all these state banks popping up is that every single one of them has their own paper money. So hundreds of paper currency appear, many of which were valueless. And so as a result of this, as a result of all these state banks popping up and doing wildcat banking, the country is going to suffer from severe financial instability. And the economy is going to be hurt for years and years to come. And so Jackson almost single-handedly completely ruined the national currency. The national currency was destroyed. And we will not have a national currency again until the Civil War. And finally, the last issue that we're going to be dealing with in Andrew Jackson's presidency is westward expansion and Indian removal. Remember, Americans are continuing to move west, and they're moving into the Great Plains, and they're moving into the modern-day South. Now, Southerners are usually moving west to find land where they can grow cotton. So, Southerners are moving into the modern-day South. They're moving into Alabama, they're moving into Mississippi, they're moving into Arkansas, and increasingly, they're moving into Mexican Texas. And while they're moving, of course, they're taking their slaves and their cotton with them. Northerners are also moving west, and Northerners are moving into the Midwest, so places like Illinois and Indiana, those types of places. So, remember, the West is not empty. They're moving there, but people live there, specifically Native Americans. And all this westward expansion is going to lead to the demise of Native Americans in the Midwest. The chief obstacle to westward migration and settlement were Native Americans who lived there. And the federal government already had several treaties with various tribes. But as more and more white settlers move west, there's going to be more and more pressure on the federal government to give them land. And so each and every time, the federal government will either break its treaty with the Native Americans that live there, or they will violate their treaty with Native Americans that live there. And in many cases, white settlers would not abide by treaty rules. They would just go in there and do whatever they wanted. An additional problem for Midwest Native Americans was debt. By this point, their traditional way of life has largely been destroyed. And so, in order to provide for their tribes, in order to get food, in order to get medicine, in order to get clothing, oftentimes these tribes would fall into debt, and they would be forced to sell their land to speculators. And we see this happen to the Choctaw, we see this happen to the Creek, we see this happen to the Chickasaw. They fall into debt and lose their land and get shoved west. Disease is also a big problem for the Native Americans of the Midwest. Americans brought with them diseases such as smallpox, which will wipe out numerous tribes such as the Pawnee, the Missouri, the Kansas tribes. So disease is going to be something they're facing. And also war. There's going to be war with the federal government. Whenever Indians resisted white encroachment, the federal government would respond with force. And a good example of this was the Black Hawk War in 1832, which of course the Indians lose. Every single war that the Indians fight with the federal government, they lose. The net result of all these things, of treaties being broken, of falling into debt, of disease, of war, is that the Indians' presence in today's Midwest disappears. After they get rid of the Indians in the Midwest, we begin to see a change in policy in the South, because there are still Indians in the South. And this happens with the Indian Removal Act of 1830. In the South, the tribes tended to be larger and the tribes tended to be better organized, so they weren't as easy to dislodge as the Native Americans in the Midwest. But what this did mean was that in the South, we had almost constant warfare between white settlers and Native Americans from colonial times up into the 1830s. There was basically one big, long war between white settlers and Indians. But in 1830, instead of trying to find accommodation with Native Americans, policy shifts. And this policy now becomes complete Indian removal from the South. And that's what the Indian Removal Act said. It became the official policy of the United States to remove Native Americans from the South. So this act did a few things. First, it allowed the federal government to trade land west of the Mississippi for land east of the Mississippi. It allowed the federal government to trade land west of the Mississippi for land east of the Mississippi. In other words, they're going to take Native American land in the east and instead give them some land in the west. So it's forced trading. And this will allow the federal government to forcibly remove the Indians to the west. So we're going to see forced relocations. And in response to this act, several tribes, such as the Creek tribe, are going to be forced to relocate. There is going to be resistance to this removal, however, specifically from the Cherokee. The Cherokee lived in Georgia, and they had accommodated themselves to the American way of life. The Cherokee had democracy. The Cherokee, by this point, have adopted Christianity. The Cherokee owned individual property. The Cherokee even owned slaves. So for all intents and purposes, the Cherokee have assimilated into American society. They've accommodated themselves to American way of life. Nevertheless, the Cherokee, just like other tribes in the South, are going to be removed. And there's several reasons for their removal. The first was straight up white land lust. The whites wanted the Cherokees' land to grow cotton. So they're in the way, we want their land, we're going to kick them out. That's the first reason. A second reason for the Cherokee removal is racism. European Americans tended to view Native Americans as being uncivilized. They viewed them as unchristian. They viewed them as heathens, undeserving of respect. And so because so many Native Americans have died off and have disappeared, many people argued they're dying off anyway. Why do we need to try to preserve them? Why are we trying to keep them alive? It'd just be better for them to go away. A third cause for this removal is, of course, federal policy. The federal government has decided that Indians are an obstacle to white expansion, and they've decided that we're just going to remove them, whether they've assimilated or not. Indians need to go. And finally, there's Jackson's attitude with regard to Native Americans. Well, Jackson has a really complicated relationship with Native Americans. He probably didn't hate them personally, but he did view them very paternalistically. And he probably sincerely believed that moving Native Americans west was for their own good, that this would be the fatherly thing to do, to move them west. It would protect them, it would keep them away from white greed, it would keep them away from white violence, so it's really just best if we move them. Nevertheless, in his heart of hearts, Jackson really did believe that Indians were destined for extinction. He thinks that they're on their way out, and so he's not really that interested in protecting them either. The sooner they move out of the way of white settlement, probably the better. So the trigger, the thing that sparks Indian removal of the Cherokee, is that in the late 1820s, gold will be discovered on their land. And so there will be a renewed effort by the state of Georgia to remove the Cherokee. And the state of Georgia will pass laws attempting to dissolve the Cherokee Constitution and take away Cherokee property. So it's the state of Georgia trying to do this to get the gold. Well, the Cherokee, like I told you, they've assimilated, and so they fight back, and they sue the state of Georgia in 2 Supreme Court cases. And by the way, they win in both cases. And these cases are called Cherokee v. Georgia in 1831 and Worcester v. Georgia in 1832. And in these cases, the Supreme Court ruled that the Cherokee Nation was a sovereign nation and that Georgia could not enter their territory without permission. So, the Cherokee Nation is a sovereign nation, and Georgia cannot enter their territory without permission. Furthermore, if the federal government wanted to move the Cherokees, they would need to have a new treaty. They can't just pass this act, right, saying the Indian Removal Act. They need to have a treaty. The Indians have to agree to this. So, the Cherokee win. The Supreme Court sides with them. But here's the way our system works. Jackson sums it up famously by saying, John Marshall, who is the Supreme Court Justice, he says, John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. In other words, the Supreme Court can say anything it wants, but it's the executive branch that carries out those actions. And Jackson just refused to listen. And so, to try to avert violence, a teeny tiny group of Cherokees, about 500 people out of about 17,000, agreed to a new treaty with Jackson, which traded Cherokee land for land west of the Mississippi. And Congress ratified the treaty. The whole thing was pretty shady. And so because of this, the Cherokee lose their land. And in 1838, General Winifred Scott is going to invade the Cherokee Nation and force them to travel 1,000 miles from Georgia to Oklahoma. And this trek is called the Trail of Tears. And you can see it on that map there. That red arrow is the routes that they had to take. On the Trail of Tears, about 4,000 Cherokee are going to die along the way. And when they finally get to Oklahoma, it's not like Oklahoma was empty. Other Indians were living there as well, and they faced almost immediate warfare with the tribes there. So for the Cherokee, this was something horrible that happened to them. Jackson's attitudes towards Native Americans and African Americans, because remember he's a slave owner, may have helped provoke one of the largest slave revolts in U.S. history, called the Seminole Revolt. Remember, slave revolts are very, very rare, but this is one of the ones that happened that were kind of significant. So, the Seminoles were Indians that lived in northern Florida. And the Seminole Indians would actually provide refuge for escaped slaves. If slaves could escape and find their way into Seminole territory, the Seminoles would protect them. In 1836, the Seminoles and their free black population, they were called Black Seminoles, began attacking plantations, began killing masters, and began freeing slaves. And this revolt spread to neighboring plantations, and the conflict really, really spread. Eventually, white settlers would strike back, but a war will basically rage from 1836 until about 1842, when the Seminoles are finally defeated. So this was a really big uprising, the Seminole Revolt, this kind of combination between slaves and Indians. And it'll last until 1842, when they are brutally put down. So the final big issue that goes on in Andrew Jackson's presidency is, well, not really presidency, but kind of set up by Andrew Jackson's presidency and left to his successor, is the Panic of 1837. So Jackson leaves office in 1836. He's done being president then. And Jackson's new vice president, Martin Van Buren, gets elected president in 1836. Unfortunately for Van Buren, he inherits Jackson's policies. And these policies are going to create a panic in 1837 so deep that it will not be equaled until the Great Depression of the 1930s. So there's lots of causes for the Panic of 1837. One of the biggest causes was that after Indian removal, a bunch of land opened up, and speculators began purchasing Western land with paper money from these wildcat banks. But remember, that paper money, that wildcat bank money, was very unstable. And so the system was incredibly shaky, and it wasn't working well. And so people would gain land and lose land very, very quickly. So, in order to try to fix this, Jackson issued something called the Specie Circular in 1836. The Specie Circular was an executive order requiring that the government cease accepting paper money as currency and only accept species for all items, including public land. So if you wanted to buy land from the government, if you wanted to pay your taxes, if you wanted to pay a fee, you had to pay in gold. You had to pay in specie. This basically said that the federal government thought paper money was worthless. And if the federal government says we're not accepting it because it's worthless, guess what? It immediately becomes worthless, even if it was worth something. Overnight, all paper money becomes worthless because the government doesn't accept it anymore. So this made things even worse for Western settlers, who usually did not have access to specie. Now their paper money is worthless. So for Westerners, this was a disaster, the Specie Circular. It basically destroyed any economic security that they had. There were other effects of the Specie Circular. This caused an immediate drop in demand for Western land, because obviously you can't afford it now that you have to pay in gold. And it also caused specie to drain from the major banks. Everybody starts taking out all their gold, all their silver. And this created a shortage and deflation. And so hundreds of banks that yesterday were completely fine today go out of business because all their specie has been taken. And remember, when a bank goes out of business, you're broke. And so thanks to the Specie Circular, nearly a fourth of all banks in the United States will close. And there's no central bank to help because Jackson has already killed the second bank of the United States. And so as a result, the country is going to spiral into a deep and terrible depression. So this finally brings us to the election of 1840. Thanks to the Panic of 1837, unsurprisingly, the Democrats are very unpopular. Remember, Jackson was a Democrat, Van Buren was a Democrat. So the Democrats, very, very unpopular. So Van Buren will lose to the Whig Party. He loses to the Whig William Henry Harrison. Harrison famously ran on this campaign slogan, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. See, Harrison was a military general who had won a great victory against the Shawnee Indians at Tippecanoe in 1811. So everybody kind of knew about this victory, and he was famous. And his running mate was John Tyler, right? So Tippecanoe and Tyler too is what he was running on. So Harrison sets lots of records, William Henry Harrison does. Harrison was 68 years old, so he would be the oldest person to be elected president until Ronald Reagan. So he was the oldest. Harrison also wanted to prove that he was still young and vigorous, right? Because he's so old. So on his inaugural day, even though it's wet, even though it's cold, he delivers the longest inaugural address in American history. So he sets that record. His inaugural address takes over 2 hours to read. And so, because he was standing in the wet and the rain and the cold for 2 hours, he subsequently developed pneumonia. And he would die only 32 days after taking office as president. And so William Henry Harrison also has the shortest tenure of any president in U.S. history, and he's also the first to die in office. So he sets lots of records, most of them not good. Thus, his vice president, John Tyler, then becomes the first vice president to succeed to the office of presidency due to the death of the incumbent. So remember your discussion question from very early on. Compare the elections of 1828 and 2012, specifically with regard to the tensions between economic classes and how the candidates used those tensions. What does this comparison tell us about the long-term structure of American society and politics? And finally, now that we have gone through this lecture, you should be able to list the 3 specific parts of the market revolution in the early 19th century and evaluate how the United States developed during this era. You should be able to describe the growth of America's middle class during the first half of the 1800s and discuss some of the stronger movements towards reform during this era. You should be able to describe the changes that took place in American politics during the first decades of the 1800s and explain reasons for these changes. You should be able to explain Jackson's big issues of the spoil system, nullification crisis, bank war, Indian removal, Panic of 1837. And you should be able to explain the development of America's second two-party political system.